Hey everyone, this is Sanskriti Varshanay from Molecular Detectives. Here, I share information about cancer, from the molecular level to things in our daily lives and environment that affect cancer development. My goal is to explain the intriguing science behind cancer in meaningful episodes that will help you understand preventative measures, cancer signs, and treatment methods, and ultimately for you to make evidence-based decisions to minimize the risk of cancer. Thank you for joining me in today's episode, and I hope you enjoy. From asbestos to air pollution, I'm going to investigate the links between environmental exposures and cancer. How much risk do these pose, and what regulations help mitigate them? These are some questions that I'm going to answer. I know I already mentioned some of these in other podcasts, but I'll discuss them and other new ones more in detail. After all, they're really important. Let's get started. Did you know that according to Scientific American, 1 in 4 deaths around the world can be associated with environmental issues? Lots of diseases like cancer, heart disease, and respiratory diseases could be prevented by fixing these environmental issues. And according to the National Cancer Institute, 2 out of 3 cancer cases also result from environmental factors like tobacco, alcohol, radiation, infectious agents, and pollution. Being exposed to pollution, heat, and other environmental issues results from racial discrimination and discrimination against people with lower incomes, causing some groups to be more at risk for diseases. Now, you may be thinking that environmental issues are things outdoors like pollution of the air and water, chemicals everywhere, and climate change. But in this case, according to the VCU Massey Comprehensive Cancer Center, environmental issues can include anything that's not in our body but interacts with our body. In other words, outside things coming into our body. Now, let's talk about things in the environment, both tangible and intangible, that are bad for us to get exposed to. First, I'll go into detail about environmental factors that people may bring upon themselves. Smoking is one of the biggest risk factors for cancer. Smoking can cause more than 16 different types of cancers, the biggest ones caused by smoking being lung cancer and bowel cancer. Lots of chemicals in cigarettes and cigars weaken the immune system, and many of the 70 carcinogens in tobacco smoke bind to DNA, making it harder for DNA to replicate and get transcribed, which increases chances of mutations. This ultimately leads to cancer. Alcohol is another big risk factor for cancer. It can cause mouth cancer, throat cancer, liver cancer, esophageal, and breast cancers. Acetaldehyde, a carcinogenic compound formed from alcohol, also damages DNA and increases risk for mutations. Alcohol can also cause other risk factors like inflammation, oxidative stress, and hormonal imbalances. It can also make it easier for the body to absorb other carcinogens, which is really harmful. Taking drugs can also lead to cancer. According to the Cancer Research Institute, drugs like cocaine and heroin are mixed with cutting agents that increase the amount of product, and these cutting agents are often carcinogens. They can lead to prostate cancer in men and endometrial cancer in women. Now, let's explore things that are less in our control. Ultraviolet radiation, or UV radiation, is a risk factor for skin cancers. Some sources that they can come from are the sun and also artificial sources like tanning beds, sun lamps, and lasers. UV radiation also damages DNA. It gets absorbed by the nitrogenous bases cytosine and thymine, which makes DNA bases go into an excited state and merge into each other. This forms pyrimidine dimers, and they change the shape of DNA double helixes. This makes it hard for DNA to replicate and can cause mutations, which may lead to cancer. UV radiation can also destroy melanocytes, which are cells that make melanin, and can lead to cancer. Next are pollutants. There are many pollutants and chemicals that were banned decades ago, but they can still be found in the environment, and that's really concerning to think about. Pollutants can cause damage to DNA repair functions like DNA repair genes. They can also weaken the body's immune response, which makes it easier for foreign substances to alter processes in the body and increase the chances of cancer developing. Pollutants can also cause inflammation that in turn causes angiogenesis, which is when new blood vessels form from existing ones. This is normally a good thing, but in cancer, that's what helps cancer spread or metastasize to other parts of the body, and that's super bad for the body. In digestive organs like the stomach and liver, pollutants can cause imbalances in gut microbiota, which are the microorganisms in your digestive tract. These imbalances can lead to cancer by increasing other risk factors like inflammation. Pollutants in the air and drinking water are really hard to avoid because we can't see them, and they can negatively affect certain racial groups more than others. Risa Ashbrook-Kilfoy, associate professor of family medicine at UChicago, and her team studied the association between the concentration of pollutants in a person's environment and their risk for developing cancer. They determined that the association between the concentration and risk was really high. Specifically, they found a significant association between increasing levels of airborne pollutants in a person's zip code area and increasing risk for cancers such as breast cancer, ovarian cancer, blood cancer, and endometrial cancer. They also noticed that Black and Asian people had a higher risk of getting blood cancers, and Hispanic people had a higher risk of getting bone cancer, breast cancer, and endometrial cancer. In another study, Anand Patel, a medical oncologist and researcher at UChicago Medicine, and his colleagues studied the effects of air pollution on the types of diseases people got and their survival outcomes. Black and Hispanic patients with acute myeloid leukemia were exposed to more pollutants associated with leukemia than white patients with acute myeloid leukemia. They also found that being exposed to PAHs, or polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and polycyclic organic matter was associated with more dangerous diseases. Researchers are further exploring how the environment affects genetics that lead to environment-associated diseases like cancer. This is called epigenetics. Next, let's talk about chemicals called PFAS, or per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances. PFAS are man-made chemicals that last for a long time. They can be found on a lot of household items like furniture and food packaging because of their special properties like being heat, grease, and water resistant. Because of how long it takes for these chemicals to break down, PFAS have the nickname forever chemicals. PFAS may lead to cancer by damaging DNA, which can cause mutations. They can also just interfere with normal cell functions, which can lead to uncontrolled cell growth. PFAS can also increase cancer growth. According to a study by the Keck School of Medicine of USC, people who consume drinking water contaminated with PFAS can have up to a 33% higher risk of getting certain cancers. This study was the first to study the risk of PFAS-contaminated drinking water on cancer in the United States, and it was funded by the National Institutes of Health and published in the Journal of Exposure Science and Environmental Epidemiology, which shows how important the study was. PFAS have been found in 45% of drinking water supplies throughout the U.S. That number is really high, and PFAS can cause kidney, breast, and testicular cancers. Researchers from the Keck School of Medicine found that PFAS in drinking water led to more than 6,800 cancer cases per year based on data from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Now, let's talk about other pollutants in the air. According to the American Association for Cancer Research, a study shows that pollution is not only associated with lung cancer, but can also be linked to breast cancer, liver cancer, and pancreatic cancer. 66,280 Hong Kong residents were part of the study. They were recruited between 1998 and 2001, and they were followed by the researchers until 2011, when the researchers learned about their cause of death from Hong Kong registrations. The researchers studied the annual concentrations of PM2.5 in the subjects' homes. PM2.5 are fine particles that have a diameter of less than 2.5 micrometers. From this, they determined that the risk of dying from any cancer increased by 22% for every 10 micrograms per cubic meter of increased exposure to PM2.5. The mortality risks for other cancers were higher. The mortality risk for breast cancer was 80%. In fact, researchers at the National Institutes of Health found that areas with lots of pollution were associated with an increased risk of developing breast cancer. It's also important to consider air pollution from previous years, as breast cancer takes many years to develop, so pollution levels from previous years matter a lot. Now, let's move on to arsenic. Arsenic is a naturally occurring element that's found in small amounts in the environment. We usually take in very small amounts of arsenic through breathing and drinking water, but taking in high levels of arsenic from the environment can be dangerous. Arsenic can cause inflammation, oxidative stress, it can change gene expression, it can directly cause DNA damage like breaking DNA strands, and it can decrease the body's ability to repair DNA damage, which can all lead to cancer. While more research needs to be done to determine how consuming small amounts of arsenic can affect the body, taking in large amounts of arsenic can cause bladder cancer. According to a study, bladder cancer risk greatly increased as water intake levels increased, especially in areas where people used wells that were made before 1960, which is when arsenic pesticides were widely used in those areas. Next are disinfection byproducts. So disinfection byproducts are compounds that form when disinfectants like chlorine, chlorine dioxide, or ozone mix with organic matter in water. These byproducts are not intentional and they can be very harmful. A study in Iowa found that drinking water with disinfection byproducts for long periods of time, specifically more than 40 years, was associated with developing rectal and bladder cancers. Trihalomethanes, specifically, are disinfection byproducts that are associated with bladder cancer. While more research is needed, disinfection byproducts can cause cancer by causing DNA damage and affecting cellular functions. Finally, I'll talk about nitrates. Drinking water contaminated by nitrates can cause N-nitrosyl compounds to be formed in the body, which are carcinogens. Higher ingestion of water nitrate and meat intake led to increased risks of colon, kidney, and stomach cancers. As I mentioned in previous podcasts, N-nitrosyl compounds damage DNA, which can lead to cancer growth. Okay, so I talked about a lot of environmental risks that can lead to cancer. And to be honest, a lot of these aren't in our control. However, it's not all doom and gloom. You can control exposure to an extent. Avoid foods and processed meats that have high chemical levels, and drink filtered water to avoid ingesting chemicals this way. Avoid smoking, drinking alcohol, and taking drugs. And also, try not to store water in plastic bottles, as plastic bottles can have arsenic, and in the heat, chemicals from the plastic can leach into the water. Avoid microwaving plastic and putting it in the dishwasher. If you spend time outdoors, try exercising or spending time in places with minimal air pollution. Try not to be outdoors in areas with lots of traffic, as pollution from cars and trucks is highest in these areas. If you're outside in the sun, make sure to wear protective clothing and put on sunscreen to avoid UV radiation, and get tests to check for chemicals in your homes. In the future, as more research is done, more chemicals and things in the environment are probably going to get identified as things that can cause cancer, and more chemicals may get banned. So my hopes are high for a future with fewer environmental risks. This was an information-packed episode. I went over a lot of different environmental risks, both things that we can avoid and some things that aren't completely in our control, and how they all connect to cancer. That's it for this time. Thank you for listening, and please stay tuned for the next episode.